There's also a webinar that I did on the research itself that is on the Brain and Behavior Foundation. So if you are really interested in the research piece that I do, there's a very detailed webinar on that was made for the public. So that's available too. So anorexia nervosa in adults. So this is really an interesting illness in that it's the only psychiatric illness that's actually based on a physical symptom like this weight loss. So you get diagnosed with the illness when you suppress your weight below what is normal for you is the current diagnosis. So if you were 180 pounds most of your life and you drop to 120, even though you're not officially in the underweight range for adults, we do diagnose that as an illness because that's the weight suppression. So this is a huge biological signal to have your weight be much lower than what your brain, your hormones, your physiology have decided it should be. Now, when your weight gets that low, generally the people are diagnosed as a psychiatric illness because they have disturbed perception about what their body is like. Their self-esteem depends on what they look like. And they have fears about changing their body, fears of weight gain and things like that. So that is a psychological factor that comes in. Now this illness is not that uncommon. It's about 1% of women, so that's the same incidence as schizophrenia. It's about 5 times more common in women. And it has the highest mortality rate, as you are all aware. So this is a very hard illness to treat. And then some of the things that motivated me going into research in this is that this is an important thing, and I don't think the treatments that we have are optimal for the patients. And so even when people get the right treatments, 50 to 70% relapse and become chronic, and it does take years. So there was a recent study that at 9 years 30% of people recover from anorexia. At 22 years it's 60%. I mean, you might as well not have treatment if it's going to take 22 years to get to recovery, right? So that's really scary. So then we have bulimia nervosa, which is very, very similar to anorexia nervosa, and it involves binge eating behaviors, but the same kind of self-esteem based on image. Now, really the only difference that's concrete is that bulimia nervosa people they're not underweight when they have the symptoms. And so that's kind of an arbitrary thing. And the overeating occurs in combination with these compensatory behaviors, which could be vomiting, fasting, laxatives, or excessive exercise. So all of those things are to compensate for eating. And so people have different amounts of how much they binge versus how much they purge. It varies a lot. Basically, you have to do either of those things about once a week for us to give you the diagnosis of the illness. But it also has very severe medical complications because there's a lot of electrolyte imbalances and cardiac problems and GI dysfunction, gastrointestinal bleeds, things like that from purging behaviors and all of that. So it has an elevated mortality. It's not quite as high as the anorexia nervosa. It's more common, about 3%. It's also more common in women. And it has a more fluctuating course. So that's one of the things that makes it hard to get patients with bulimia nervosa to stick with kind of outpatient treatment, is that the stress happens, they binge, they purge for 3 or 4 months, then they get past the stress, all the symptoms go away, they think they're fine, and then they might be fine for 1 to 6 years or 2 months. We don't know. It's a very fluctuating. The anorexia nervosa is a more consistent control of calories, concern about the body image. The patients with anorexia nervosa seem to have a more consistent low-grade level of symptoms all the time until they make it to kind of sustained recovery. With bulimia nervosa, we're much more likely to see this fluctuating course where people have a lot of symptoms and then don't have a lot of symptoms, and that kind of ties together with depression, is often very comorbid. So when they get depressed, the binge purge behaviors kind of pick up, and then they get out of depression or out of anxiety, change their job, finish their college, whatever it is, they get better. So that makes it harder to keep the people with bulimia sort of in steady outpatient treatment, so that if they start, because what you really want, what I see as a psychiatrist is what I want is to have a patient that's in outpatient treatment and is regularly coming to see me every if they're doing well, every 2 or 3 months they come in. And that way, if things start to get out of control, they have a clinical relationship they can easily re-engage in and say, oh no, I started having binge purge. I haven't had that for a year, 2 years. And so really keeping that regular relationship with the therapist, the psychiatrist, I think is really important in helping people that have had this illness stay recovered. And that if you're not doing these physical things like losing all the weight, vomiting, purging, all those behaviors, laxative abuse, you're much less likely to have the serious deathly consequences of the illness than that. And so then there's this idea that treatment should produce recovery. But most of the existing treatments really focus on the acute behavioral changes in the binge purge, the restricting. So helping people learn how to eat when they have anorexia, restoring their bodies physically. And so this eat more, it seems like this should be easy. This is not easy for the patients. If it was easy, they would do it, but generally it's taken years to get to where they are. So years of cutting out fat, years of saying I shouldn't eat this, I should never eat a carbohydrate. Like those thoughts are ingrained, and so it takes a really long time to get them to feel like they can be a good person and be eating the food and that. And so current existing treatments, the treatment centers for eating disorders, mostly focus on this meal support, dietetic support. So this is telling someone you can eat that, you'll be okay, and then after they eat it, if they're anxious and shaking, you sit with them, you help them get through it. It really does work short term. So in the short term, we can take someone with the illness and fix the symptoms most of the time, occasionally. But I would say that there's probably 3 patients I've seen that we really couldn't do much with when they were in a facility getting treatment. But then they discharge from these facilities and they still have the stressors, they still have the environmental stuff that was promoting the eating behaviors, and they don't have enough support to change. And so in psychiatry, we have sort of this trifecta of there's the behaviors in the illness, there's the cognitions, which are kind of the conscious thoughts in your head, and then there's the emotional component to all of this, the anxiety, the depression, which may or may not be easily verbalized. So sustained recovery. So when I started in this field about 10 years ago, I focused on what matters with sustained recovery because my interest was in studying how the brain changes when people get better. And that really, I came into this at very much a neuroscientist more than a psychiatrist, and I was interested in understanding how does the brain change when people get to recovery. And so sustained recovery was associated with much better relationships with the people that are around you, the actual people you spend time with. You feel like they're supportive, you feel like they're engaged. It's also associated with higher self-esteem and improved self-knowledge. And so this is not, objectively, this doesn't mean that they change who they relate to in their lives. This means that they're able to be more honest about what stresses them with the people that they spend time with. So there's an ability to sort of verbalize, this makes me uncomfortable, which isn't there when they're sick. So when they're sick, there's sort of this shame associated with verbalizing negative emotions. And I think that comes out of this starvation state and the impaired food, is that when you don't have enough food, one of the models we have is that biologically that means everybody else in the world is not helping me because there's no food. So even if you choose, whether you lose weight, whether you choose to lose weight whether you intentionally choose to diet or whether you accidentally lose a lot of weight because of, say, cancer treatment or something, that same brain effect happens, that it becomes much harder to trust the people you're with. And so that's some of the work that we're trying to do. Okay, so just briefly, how do we study the brain? So I like the model that we have biology, which is what's in our brain, the genes that form our brain, the neural circuits in our brain, and then we have the conscious, the psyche, where we have the thoughts that we have, the eating beliefs, the body image thoughts, and then we have our environment, our social environment, which has dieting and stressor. So when we use a brain scanner, we have people go in a machine and we're looking at how the the hemoglobin is actually being oxygenated and deoxygenated. So we're looking at how the blood, so unless you're having a stroke, all the time you're having oxygen extracted from the blood in your brain, and we can actually pick up those signals because it changes the iron status of hemoglobin in the brain. And so if you think about something more, if you use a particular area of the brain to do something, we have more oxygen being extracted. So we get what we call the signal. So that's what we're measuring. We're measuring how oxygen is extracted from the brain, and they call this the bold signal, based on the thoughts people are actually having. And so the first studies that were done around 2000 or so with this technique was really just looking at what happens if we have a checkerboard on the screen, and you're looking at a checkerboard, areas of the brain that are involved in detecting light versus dark squares, and they used all of that. So when I decided to become a psychiatrist, it was largely because you could now look at subtle differences in thinking about yourself, thinking about your friends, thinking about what you want out of life, all of those components, and look at how different areas of the brain are used. And I thought this would give us a better way to understand psychiatric illnesses, because the patient, previously, all of our understanding of psychiatric illnesses in the, prior to 1990 or so, was based on what the patients told us. The behaviors they had and their ability to express the thoughts in their head. But this isn't enough, because only a small fraction of the process of thinking is actually conscious. So like you're not consciously saying, I know this is Brooks, I know that's Patty. You just are putting together those images, and it's not a conscious process of extracting all of these features and let me see who is this. Most of our thinking is kind of unconscious. We're putting together information. And so that's where in psychiatry we've been struggling, because the patient's we assume that your ability to answer a question involves the exact same circuits that mine do. That's an assumption. And even if you give the same answer, that doesn't mean the people are actually using the same parts of the brain. So that's what I was really interested in studying. Okay, so I got a grant from NIH to look at how people, and I picked 3 groups of people. So throughout the rest of it, we're going to have sort of healthy controls in green, and then we have the people that currently or recently had anorexia in blue, and then we have the weight recovered women with anorexia in pink. And so what they did in the scanner was they read sentences, and the sentences were about themselves and their social values. So I believe I am considerate, and we compared agreeing and disagreeing with that statement, and we had other statements that were like, Brooks believes I am realistic. So they would give me the name of a specific female friend that they had, and they'd be looking at what parts of my brain are engaged when I think about how other people think about me. And the reason we picked these kinds of sentences is because we knew what parts of the brain were supposed to be involved in healthy people. So in healthy people, there's a pretty normal neural circuit that's very in the middle of the brain, kind of our primitive cortex area, which says this is who I am. And that is very robust pathway. When you ask me a question about myself, the middle of my brain lights up. When you ask me a question about what other people think about me or what other people think, you add on regions of the brain that are kind of on the outside of the brain. And those areas are used, like they're social engagement areas. You have to do social reasoning. And so we were interested in whether people with eating disorders who seem so sensitive to other people's criticisms and worried about how other people think about them, whether there were differences in how they perceived other people versus whether there were differences in thinking about themselves. And so that's really kind of the fundamental tool that we've used to kind of get at how the brain works. And so just really briefly, when we do this, we do a whole lot of math and statistics on the brain, and ultimately we do a comparison to find out what areas of the brain are being used differently. And so that's what I've sort of represented here. And so that area in the front of the brain that you see on the top figure is the bright yellow spots. Those areas are used in healthy people when you agree with a sentence about yourself. But they're used in both patient populations, both the people that are currently ill and the long-term weight recovered patients, when they disagree with sentences. And so we think this is probably a normal neurodevelopmental process that occurs through high school. So in high school, you decide I'm not an actress before you decide I am a scientist, for example. You exclude things before you include who you are. And so some of the work I've done in children, and I know something for Kelly's really interested in how this process of the brain development and high school and childhood really leads to people. And so that ability to say this is what I'm not versus this is what I am, is a normal neurodevelopmental process. And some of our hypotheses are that because of reduced fat intake, children may not make the connections to start saying, this is who I am, this is what I agree with. So that's some of the work we're doing now. But this was a surprising result. So I just want to point that out. We did not expect this at all. I didn't expect that the weight recovered people would continue to show this difference in disagreeing compared to agreeing. And I also, if you look behaviorally at the things they answer to, they're answering the questions in the same way. So if you look behaviorally at how they think they're thinking, they're agreeing with the same percentage of statements, they're agreeing with the same number of positive, negative, all of that is the same for the weight recovered group and the healthy control. So there's no insight into what's different. So it's only by using this advanced technology that we start to understand how the neural circuits are different in this illness. And so now on the more exciting side, when you look at this process of thinking about other people, and you look at the next figure, the compensation and recovery, what you see here is that the pink people, our weight recovered people, look very different from both the healthy controls and the patients that were recently sick. And this was really one of the most exciting things that we found, which is that really the people that recover are now using the social cognitive parts of their brain, that outside areas of the brain that are involved in thinking about other people, to answer questions about themselves. So this is what we would call a neural compensation. So when you're healthy, you use the outside of your brain to answer the questions about what other people think about you. In order to make it to recovery, you have to learn how to use that to answer questions about yourself. And so from a clinical sort of example of this, I work with a patient and they think, oh, I'm terrible at everything, and you say, well, it sounds like your teacher really appreciates what you're doing with this class. It sounds like you're working really well. And so if you do that enough over time, we think that our patient then learns, what, my immediate feeling is that I'm not good enough, but let me put it in the context of what would my therapist say, what would my friends say, really I am enough, like I've got these evaluations. So it's so that inner core is still saying I'm not good enough, but the outer core is saying the facts are, the reasoning is sort of the conscious. And so these areas that are different are all part of a network that's thought to be involved in conscious decision making. And so that's what's really interesting here, is that the areas that turn on when they think about themselves, so that's why the bars go down. It's like the difference in thinking about yourself versus the difference in doing this reflected perspective taking changes. And so this was really exciting. This was some of the most exciting data that we got, because it starts to tell me how therapy works, how the recovery process works, and what has to change to get people to recovery. And so we call those kind of these neurocognitive targets. Now, if we go back to that biopsychosocial model where we have our biology, our brain, and then we have our thoughts, and then we have the environment, one of the important things, in my opinion, in doing research is that we're able to take what I find in this very expensive scanner and bring it back to clinical practice. Because we're not gonna, it doesn't make sense from any kind of health insurance policy perspective to think scanning everyone, zapping everyone's brain is going to be the right solution for these illnesses. It's too expensive, too hard to access, unlikely to ever happen that we're going to be, brain stimulation is going to be a solution. I mean, we already have healthcare dollar issues. So what we want is we want to be able to understand what in the office can tell me if my patient is moving in the direction of recovery. So we want something that any person, any doctor, psychologist can, by talking to the patient, can get a sense of, okay, this means their brain is working like this. And because their brain is working like this, we want to do something differently. So when we did this study, in addition to the brain measures, we had a whole bunch of office measures. So they had this giant packet of questionnaires. Now it's all online, but at the time they had a packet of questionnaires, and we measured depression, anxiety, self-esteem, their ability to detect emotions, and all of these things. And one of the measures that we did correlated really well with their brain activity in these tasks, and gives us a very specific cognitive target. And so if we look at this, what's an attribution bias? This questionnaire consists of 32 statements like this, and you see the top part, your friend refused to give you a ride home, and you have to write in why. So you have to self-generate your immediate first thought, and those are the instructions the patients get. It's the very first thought you have about why someone would refuse to give you a ride home. And then we code it based on whether the answer is about me, like I'm a messy person, last time I gave a ride, I spilled soda in their car, they're never gonna let me in the car again, or it's about the friend, my friend hates to drive, they're not gonna give me a ride, or it's about the situation, it would be inconvenient for that person to do that. And so everybody sort of, when they go through life, things happen, and we immediately create our story about why that happens. So what was fascinating to us was that the ability, how you answered these questions about yourself. And so one of the measures from this thing is called the externalizing bias, which doesn't make any sense really, but it's basically the different, like that term is not, I did not invent it, but the term is basically the difference. So if you said something was about you, was it a good thing or a bad thing? So half the items on the questionnaire are positive. And so a good thing happens because of me. That's a self-promotion. So that's why this axis has sort of self-promotion on the right, self-blame on the left. And what we found was that your tendency to blame yourself versus promote yourself was correlated with how much this particular region of the insula changed. And this is really fundamental to eating disorders, because a lot of research is converging that the insula may have to do with a negative self-perception and a negative tendency. But the cool thing from my perspective is that this gives us something we can target in therapy. We can target those biases about themselves, and we can talk to the patients about, how do you think about yourself? Like maybe you're thinking about yourself too critically, and over time, you can start to probably reduce the tendency to activate this area. So that's what we're looking for. Okay, so that data was all collected based on this NIH grant that I received in 2012. And in the way NIH grants work is you sort of already have to have a pretty good set of data saying that the result is going to happen. And so I had pilot data that basically was consistent with this first aim. And so I've sort of listed under it the aim. So the first one was, is the social brain function different in these groups? And the answer was yes. The second one was, does recovery differ in these three groups? And the third one was this exploratory thing, is there anything we can measure that relates to the brain? And so then we collected all that data. I met Brooks in the course of doing that, and she was really interested, and I was as well, in the course of illness. So now that we had these nice assessments, what happened to the patients over time? And so we wrote together this pilot foundation grant. There's a HOG Foundation for Mental Illness. They may have changed their name, but it's basically gives small mental illness grants out to different researchers in Texas. It's a Texas specific thing. And so they had an application that looked like we could say, okay, with this amount of money, we could call up everybody we already studied, because that's not that hard. We could invite them to come back, and we could reassess them and ask them questions about whether they recovered, what kinds of treatments they got, whether this externalizing bias changes over time was one of the big aims that we had, was that. And just what did these people look like after, and at that point, by the time we got the grant, the people that had done the original study were 2 to 6 years. So we had 2 to 6 years of sort of clinical outcome from this cohort. And so we found that 40% of the people that had been sick when I met them were now in what we'd call recent weight recovery. So they had maintained a healthy weight for a couple of years, and none of the people in our weight recovered group were sick. So this was a really good weight recovered group that we had to begin with. Every one of them had been able to continue on without relapsing into the eating disorder. Okay, so aim one of the grant was, what changes with recovery? So we had the assessments at the beginning. So in this table, there's like two numbers, and the number on the left in each column is sort of what they scored on the test when we first met them, and the number on the right is what they scored on the test when they came back. And then we have sort of differences. And so I highlighted in blue things that were different for our currently ill anorexia. So at baseline, the people that were sick had higher scores on a test of eating, which makes sense. And then the stuff in pink is what changed over the time, over the course of recovery, what actually has to change. And so the people in the middle are the ones that had been sick, but now are in weight recovery. And so their depression scores got lower, and that externalizing bias actually improved. So that gave us kind of two things that need to be targeted in treatment. And what's important here is that almost all of the existing work in eating disorders has focused entirely on those top two things, the eating pink thoughts and the body image thoughts. And so if we're targeting things, and I think it's particularly striking that the body shape thing does not change at all for any of the groups. So even our weight recovered patients are still critical of their body. Potentially because they are weight recovered, they still continue to have that. So a lot of the eating disorder treatments that exist right now really focus on changing how people think about eating and how they think about their body. But if you actually want to move them into recovery, you may need to target how they think about themselves and other people, and this tendency to blame themselves for bad things. Those would be more effective targets if you're actually trying to promote recovery. And so the bottom is just that graph of this externalizing bias change, and you can see that the people that stay sick they don't change, they continue to blame themselves for all the negative things, and the people that are healthy or that were weight recovered at baseline, are now taking credit for good things. And then the people that moved are moving in that same direction of taking credit for more good things. And so this is a small sample, but this is kind of an example of how a foundation grant can really make that initial NIH grant, because this whole questionnaire, this whole idea of assessing self-perception is not consistent with the existing work in eating disorders. So I wouldn't have been able to get funding to do that. And so the newest thing that we're doing is we're now have an intervention that I've constructed. And so one of the things that I didn't kind of talk about initially, I was lucky in that my exposure to eating disorders happened in a small program that was at a single site in Texas, in Dallas here, that had been existing for 32 years. It had been in Dallas, the first eating disorder treatment program in the state, and that program closed a few weeks ago because of the competition from the larger things. But when I entered that program in 2006, the second month of when I moved to Texas, I met people that really had a lot of clinical wisdom, and they knew how to treat eating disorders. They knew what needed to change intuitively, not biologically, not in the hard data, but that's what helped me formulate my proposals. And so they would have these team building activities and these things, and be talking about how people have to change how they think about themselves and others. And so they really had a good sense of it. And so working with the art therapist from there, Susan Miracle, we've built this pilot therapy program, and we ran one set of it in February, and we're actually starting the next set. It's only 4 weeks because we don't have any money for it, so it's coming out of her volunteer time and my volunteer time. I have a resident that's graduating that was very interested in doing it, so she's running part of it. So we have the people volunteered, and then we're giving free therapy, so it doesn't really cost all that much. And then my NIH funded team is doing the assessments and recruiting them. But we've basically got these activities, so you can see this little picture of this like wiffle ball with all these sticks. And so the people have to copy, they get the figure on the upper right, you see that little card there. They have to copy that onto this large piece of paper, but they have to copy it cooperatively. So everybody has to hold on to the sticks, and they have to learn to talk to each other, to interact, to trace the shape. It's not that easy, and it's a very active way of interacting with other people. And so we have these videos that are basically like job feedback that say, hey, you just started this job and I thought you were going to be fabulous, but really everything you've done is terrible. And you know, we have these job feedback videos, and it's nice because we show them to the group and everybody sees the same video. And so they're willing to talk about how bad the video makes them feel in a room with other people, whereas they're not willing to talk about how bad it made them feel, like, you know, in the context of like, I can't talk to my, my brother this way, or I can't talk to my, when I'm with my mom, this is too painful, and that hypersensitivity to criticism. So the combination of these two, and then we give them a little education about this is why we're doing this. We really want you to be thinking consciously about how you're internalizing your experiences with other people and all of that. So I'm hoping to get a grant that will do neuroimaging before and after the group, and then we'll get clinical follow-up on the patients for a year. And so even though it's a very brief 4 weeks, I think it'd probably be better if we had sort of 4 weeks and then we had them come back once a month in that group setting so that they build the peer relationships. The other thing that they all said was the best thing about the group was that we have a baseline rule that they do not discuss anything about their eating disorder symptoms in the room. And so a lot of times in therapy, the only way you get people to go to therapy is to be going to therapy to talk about your depression or your anxiety or your PTSD. And so this approach goes there. So that's sort of the direction that we're moving. That's one of the things that we would really love to get funding for, particularly if we could get funding to rescan the patients. So some of them I can scan before the group because they're in another study that I have from NIH, but I can't rescan them, but would like to be able to rescan them 6 months later to see if there's changes in the brain, if we start to move the pathways in that direction. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, but if you guys have any questions about the brain stuff, because Dr. Broderick is going to talk about how we connected and her story for a little bit, but if there's any brain imaging questions, now's probably the time. Yes.
I said, for our conversation last night, something you told me seemed fascinating, but I kind of lost the grip on it. It was something about the selection of friends when you are in this depressed state.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. So one of the things we had talked about is related to kind of the depression research in the brain. And so we were talking about how selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors work and how what happens in the brain when you actually take one of these medications to fix depression. And there was a meta-analysis a couple years ago that combined all the brain imaging studies, and one of the common tasks that they do in brain imaging is to have people just look at happy and sad and angry faces. So you're just looking at what is your immediate response when you see something happy, sad, angry. And what they found was that people on these SSRIs, their brain stays active. So when you see a face, it's the fusiform, it's a part of visual cortex that's active. That area of the brain is activated every time you see a face. If you see a happy face and you're on one of these SSRIs, then your brain activation persists for about 200 milliseconds. So when you see a happy face, your brain keeps signaling, I saw a happy face, I saw a happy face for 200 milliseconds. If you're not on it and you have depression, then it's only 100 milliseconds that your brain is active. And so if you think about that compounding over the course of the day, like when you interact with every person in the world, you should be choosing to interact with people that make you happy, that are happy to see you. And if you're depressed, because that happy face disappears so quickly, you don't have the ability to discriminate, this is a good relationship, this is a bad relationship. And so that's really one of the things that we were kind of talking about yesterday, is like what happens when you get someone that's depressed and you put them on medication. We're trying to help them understand who they should spend time with. So when I get a patient and I put them on an SSRI and they come back a month later and they're better, it doesn't seem like necessarily the medication is what made them better, because what actually makes them better is that they've got a new best friend, they're choosing to interact with the right people, they've found more supportive relationships over a 3-month period. So when they're depressed, they never feel good when they see other people because that brain is kind of squashed on social interaction, and they just want to stay home and hold up. And you start the medication and they start to go out, they start to notice, that, this guy at Starbucks and I have a lot in common and we're chatting now, whereas when they were depressed, they were just, working on their computer by themselves. And so it builds. And so that's the kind of thing that kind of small interventions might make, and that have big ramifications for how people interact with others. And what we're hoping here with this sort of group thing is that they'll start to trust that they can be with people outside of the illness symptoms. And so one of the things that I hate as a clinician are the patients that really like being in treatment all the time, because they like being in treatment, because they know how it works, they know that all of these people in the room are my friends, and we all talk about our symptoms, and that's a good place for us to be. But trying to get someone out of that and into the real world and learning to interact with people not talking about the illness is actually a real challenge in the current way healthcare is prescribed. Because it's you put someone's not doing well, you put them in a group, but if the group is talking about symptoms, then the patient thinks about the symptoms more. And what we really want to have happen is for them to start thinking about other things more. We want them to think about volunteer work or their jobs or that. But a lot of times the anxiety of interacting with other people is so high that they can't enter that, they can't enter that animal shelter, they can't sign up for that class, they can't do it because they have so much anxiety about how to interact. And if some of the people that start in treatment at 14, and then you got them at 23 and they've been in and out of treatment, they've really had limited socialization in terms of being able to have groups of friends and peers, because every time you get pulled into one of these treatment programs, your whole life is kind of cut off. And then you have to restart it over and over again. And if anyone's ever moved, moving is one of the most stressful things for people. It's not that easy to find the people you want to relax with. So.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Every story is unique, but I do believe that there are some commonalities within the stories, and that's what we've kind of used to piece together to kind of decide where we want to go in our research. So I'm going to share a little bit of mine. Obviously, Kelly had a story, Morgan had a story, everybody has a story, but I wanted you to hear a little bit about mine and my journey and how treatment was kind of integrated in it. So, you have to pick a place obviously it builds your entire life, but the place that I really picked was really the beginning of my MD PhD program, where I had made a ginormous move. I moved to Virginia. I didn't know anybody who was starting what is a very challenging program. So for those of you who are not aware, when you join a combined MD PhD program, there were, when I started, maybe 20 in the country that were actually endorsed by the NIH. And the way it works is that you do 2 years of med school, then you go to the lab and you do 4 to 6 years and you get a PhD, and then you go back and do your last 2 years of med school. So that is actually very disruptive too from a friendship standpoint, because you have different people graduating and moving and doing different things. And there's also in exchange for that indentured servitude, as we call it, they pay for your tuition, but it's not much in terms of the cost of living and everything else that you still have to kind of pay for. So I joined that program, and there was a lot of pressure. They're like, we are investing in you. You're the future of research. You have to demonstrate that you're going to do a really awesome job. And in so doing, kind of adjusting for all that pressure, I, as having been a very anxious child all along, had compensated for this by, for instance, doing every problem in the organic chemistry book twice. It was never assigned for homework. I just did it twice because that was the way I knew it. And that had been how I had always compensated in life. Unfortunately, in med school, that's not possible. Med school has a lot of information, and there's no way you can do that. So I was kind of persistently very anxious. I did not like to eat because I felt nauseous because of the fact that I was so anxious all the time. And what I discovered was if I went to the gym and I worked out for, beginning an hour a day, that actually was the only time that my brain was not constantly saying I wasn't good enough, I couldn't do this, what's going to happen, I'm going to flunk out. So I then began this very vicious cycle where I was restricting food and I was over-exercising, and that was really the beginning, I think, of where I started to kind of go down this very deep hole into my eating disorder. And as a result, at first I actually could compensate quite well. You know, I had straight A's the second semester. I was really withdrawing socially though. And I think that people started to notice how much I began to socially withdraw because you just couldn't do all of that. And you didn't want to be around other people. You didn't want to interact. So in all of that going on, it was probably in the fall of the following year where I just started to break down. I couldn't concentrate in class. I started to have a lot of emotional breakdowns because of the fact that I couldn't concentrate in class, and it became evident to my peers and they pointed it out. Well, I'm gonna kind of fast forward because there was a lot that went on in trying to get me the treatment that I needed and how it was, and literally it did not happen for 4 years. So from the onset of my eating disorder and me saying, yes, I do have an eating disorder, I need help, it really took 4 more years. And in those 4 years, a lot goes on. And essentially what happened for me is that my identity then became my eating disorder. I had no idea how I would ever survive without it because it was the only way that I had coped for all these years with it. So when it came about that that the people who I had structured around me, my treatment team, really wanted me to go to treatment, I was petrified. I will never forget. It was a room kind of like this. There were people sitting around me who were all, physicians and therapists and dietitians. And I literally said, yes, I will go to treatment. I put my head down on the table and I cried because it was the scariest moment of my life. And I've done a lot of really challenging things, and that really still to me sticks with me as being one of the hardest decisions. So I went to treatment, and unfortunately, like a lot of people, insurance cuts off when you hit a BMI of 18. Literally the day of, they were like, you now need to go home unless your parents sign a check right now because we will not pay anymore. So I went home, I went back to the work that I had been doing as a graduate student, and I just couldn't compensate. Like, it was just such an incredibly huge change from having been in a place where they provide you with every meal and every snack, and you're not dealing with all the stresses, that I just couldn't do it. And now I didn't understand why I couldn't do it. I blamed myself for it. So I had a lot of guilt and a lot of shame for having wasted my parents' money, for not having been able to compensate. And this time, actually, I got a lot sicker. So I developed a lot more medical complications because the onset of the weight loss was very drastic. So, I ended up in the hospital, and I was really coerced again to go back to treatment the second time. So this time I went back to treatment the second time. I had to spend longer there because I was now sicker, but I had a better experience, I think, I knew what I had not done well the first time. So I went back home, and this time what I did was I restructured my treatment program. Or my treatment team at home. So I kept the same physician, so I had his continuity, but I got a new dietitian who was very experienced in eating disorders, and I got a therapist who was very experienced, had a couple of eating disorder patients, but was very used to dealing with trauma and with anxiety and with depression. So with that group, interestingly, my dietitian was actually recovered herself. And there was a group. We had a group of people, and a lot of them were further along in their journey. And so interestingly, I never realized it when I was sick, but they were actually all 18 and 20. So they were 8 years younger than I was. But they became my closest friends because I watched them. And I think that was honestly the first time I saw what real recovery was, right? Because when you're in treatment, nobody has really been out for a long time. So you don't see what it's like to truly recover from the illness. And so your perceptions are, well, this person who's just leaving treatment is recovered. And that wasn't the case. There was so much that went on in those years afterwards. So I fortunately had them, and we really made just, a tremendous amount of strides. I was actually in some of their weddings, and we've stayed very close this entire time. But what I found was really interesting, that was when I started, now I was at a healthy weight, I was making a lot of the progress I needed to, and from the psychological standpoint, working with the dietitian. And then I started to have a much better social life. Like, I started to join Junior League. I was their volunteer, coordinator. Actually, was the provisional of the year for the Junior League that year, because I could use all that energy I didn't have before that was going into my eating disorder to doing other things that I found really rewarding. I joined kickball. I could finally go to the restaurants with them afterwards and eat and enjoy the food. And it was really neat, I think, especially for my friends who had watched me, to kind of watch this all come about. And so for me, those were really kind of the key things that enabled me to get through it. And then all of a sudden, I had graduated, and I was actually thinking I was going to go back to doing what I had wanted to do when I started med school, which was I wanted to do allergy and immunology. Like, that was kind of I had done a lot of research prior to then in HIV. I really was interested in how the immune system fights off these different viruses. That was my plan. I came to UT Southwestern, and interestingly, I knew I needed to form a new treatment team because, like Dr. McAdams says, even if I wasn't going to use them all the time, I wanted them there. So if there was a slip up in residency, somebody was there, I could call them. I knew that there was the support, because the last thing I wanted was to go back to where I was. So I had met with her, and what was amazing was that a lot of this had come about, her research was just coming out when I had gone through it myself. And the commonalities between what she was studying and what I had experienced were amazing, but we both kind of had this drive to figure out, well, why do some people recover and others don't? Because for me, my roommates from treatment did not recover. And I desperately wanted for them to have what I was able to experience. I want for every single person who's been sick to have what I've experienced. And what I tell people when I lecture about the medical complications and about this illness is, as an internal medicine physician, I treat chronic illnesses every single day. There are certain things I can't undo, right? If you have smoked 30-pack years, there's gonna be damage to your lungs I just cannot undo. And we have to work with what you have. For an eating disorder, I really can. I can watch you go back to a state that where you were before your eating disorder. So although there are some kind of long-standing physical complications, they don't actually necessarily have to be there all the time if we can catch them early and get you to a healthy state early enough. So for me, that was really the driving force, was to understand, well, why do some people recover and others don't? And so if you look kind of back in your handout, that's really where we started. So we had this HOG grant, as she mentioned before, and we started to look at, okay, well, we had these 3 groups of people: the people who were still ill, the people who had been ill when we initially met them but had recovered, and then the weight recovered group. And we went back and we asked them, well, what was the age of onset of your illness? When did you first receive treatment? What was your worst age of your illness? And what was your lowest weight? Because a lot of people thought the more severe your illness, to understand why that was going on. So there was a very famous study that was done in 1944, before we had, IRBs and HIPAAs and all these other things that would never let us do these studies right now. But basically what it was that they took 36 men who were both in good physical and mental health, and they required them to lose 25% of their body weight. And the way that they did this was that for the first 3 months of the study, they gave them a normal diet of 3,200 calories per day. So then for the next 6 months, they put them in this semi-starvation state where they had to eat 1,500 or so calories per day, which was just divided between breakfast and lunch. And then they gave them a 3-month recovery period where they ate 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day. And then lastly, they did this 8 weeks of unrestricted rehabilitation, during which time they had no limitations on their caloric intake. And throughout all of this, they were required to work 15 hours per week, to walk 22 miles per week, and to participate in a variety of educational activities, because they wanted to measure their cognitive abilities during all of this as well. So and 22 miles, I actually figured it's about 3 miles a day, right? So it's not tremendously amount, but it is some physical activity, but nothing compared to what a lot of our patients are enduring. So from the physiological consequences, what they observed is they had significant decreases in their strength and stamina, their body temperature and heart rate and their sex drive all decreased. And from the psychological consequences, what they witnessed was that they became obsessed with food. They would dream and fantasize about food. They would read, they would talk about food, and they would even talk about how enjoyable it was to watch other people eat food. So if you've ever been around somebody with anorexia, it sounds really familiar, right? It sounds like a lot of the things you've witnessed. They had a lot of fatigue, irritability, depression, apathy, all the things that we really see. And they also had, what's fascinating is they had self-reported decreases in mental ability, but the mental testing did not show this. And this is why again and again I get asked, well, why are people with eating disorders able to maintain their grades? Like, why are they able to do these things? And I think there's a compensatory mechanism, and doing things like multiple choice tests doesn't tax them the same as it is doing something where they have to be creative, where you have to sit down and you have to write or something. It's a lot harder. And that's not necessarily what are picked up in these tests. So this really kind of was the basis of where, well, starvation has a lot of the same things that we see in eating disorders. So how much of this is coming from the actual state of being starved? And even in the instances where people have bulimia nervosa, what happens is that their nutritional intake is very dysregulated, right? So they might restrict all day and then binge and purge for a few hours and then restrict again until that whole cycle begins again. So it is not the kind of normal nutritional intake that we prefer to see. So that's where we came to this question of, well, what is all this brain-body connection? So is the eating disorder the etiology of it, or is the starvation the etiology of what we see as the different symptoms? And what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The very different one. And the other thing that even complicates the matters further is that it's not just, as Dr. McAdams, so eloquently described, all these brains and these thoughts, but actually our environment is more than just our social perceptions, right? It's more than just turning on the TV or looking at a magazine and saying, wow, those people are really skinny and everything. It's actually the physiological consequences that are going on that can also affect our genes. So anytime your genes can actually be modified by different things, then that can alter the expression of different genes. And so is the actual physical state of the eating disorder also altering the way that our brain thinks and what our perceptions of what's going on around us? So it's difficult and it's all complicated.
Just really quick, you may have touched on it, maybe I missed it, but the consequences that you talked about, were they experienced after the 8 weeks of, so they continued to experience them even though they were able to take as much caloric intake as they possibly wanted
No.
to?
So actually, interestingly, what happened is so that was really during the 6 weeks that they experienced it. During the 8-week period, what they noticed was that a lot of them became basically binge eaters.
Okay.
They would just eat a ton of food because you had it restricted. And so now they were like, they really wanted to overeat. But what the nice part is that actually diminished with time.
Okay.
So they became kind of, acutely binge eaters, but when they realized that the food was not going to be restricted from them again, they were able to kind of go back to being more normal in their state of it. So from a standpoint of where we wanted to look at, one of the kind of thoughts was inflammation was really big in depression, right? So inflammation, you've heard about, like it can alter a lot of things in our brain as well as in our body. And so we wanted to kind of go back and do a little bit of a pilot study to kind of see, well, is inflammation actually present in patients who have anorexia nervosa as well? And there had been one large kind of meta-analysis of 22 different studies, and they had looked at to kind of see which the cytokines are, but they hadn't really looked at it in relation to the course of the illness. They had just taken subsets of people who had been admitted to an eating disorder treatment facility. They followed them up, and they kind of saw, either 4 or 8 weeks later, however long they were there, what changes in their inflammation. But we really wanted to look at it, if we could see if it impacted the course of illness at all. So you can see in the blue, those were the cytokines. So cytokines are molecules that are released from immune cells in order to combat, viruses, bacteria, but also in relation to anything that they view as being a threat. And so the ones that we saw differences in were IL-1 beta, IL-10, IL-2, and IL-8. So we then went back and we looked at it in relation to the course of illness. So the people who'd been currently ill, the people who had recovered, and the healthy controls. And what you see is actually there's really a subset of patients that have a history of anorexia nervosa that have much higher elevated cytokine levels. So this is a logarithmic graph. And so the people who are up in the upper ends are actually much higher, like 10 times higher than what the other people are in terms of it. So there does seem to be some role of it, but we had a very small group of people that we were able to follow. So I think really being able to follow that along the course of illness and figuring out what happens to these people who have the higher inflammation states, do they not respond to treatments the same way that the other patients did, will be key for discovering, is this something that I could target? So as an internist, I like finding things that I already have drugs for that I can target, and we have a lot of drugs that we use for rheumatoid arthritis, for inflammatory bowel disease, for different illnesses, and there actually have been 2 case studies, which, as I mentioned, so in science, nobody likes anything anecdotal, right? They always want as large a group of people as you can possibly study to figure it out. And so what they had seen, though, was in 2 patients who had their eating disorder for many years, but then later developed inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. They received treatment with these anti-TNFs, which are specific drugs that target one of these inflammatory markers, and they were able, with minimal psychiatric intervention, to recover from their eating disorder. So it suggests that, in a select subset of patients, this actually may very well be an effective treatment. But identifying who those patients are, these are currently not tests we perform on people who have an eating disorder. So this is really where identifying what subset of patients that would benefit from this could be key. So that's really where we come up kind of, the next slide is really the sum of what I've explained to you, which is that for a lot of reasons, people can lose weight and become kind of obsessed with it. As we mentioned, it can be from, that they've been bullied at school and so they want to lose weight because somebody told them that. It can be from the fact they developed a diarrheal illness and they just lost all the weight accidentally. They developed cancer, they lost all the weight because of the chemotherapy. But then once they're kind of in that cycle, they're in the same cycle that I described to you, right? The low intake, the exercise becomes kind of really just pulls you in, and it's very hard to break out of that cycle. And what happens whenever you change your diet, you lose weight, you're having any of these behaviors, is that you actually change your gut microbiome. So within your gut, there are thousands of bacteria that survive, and they have a very homeostatic relationship. So if you alter those, it can actually really disrupt things. So if anybody's taken an antibiotic, you then kind of, it can alter your bowel movements afterwards because it kills off some of the good bacteria and it leaves some of the other bacteria there, right? So we see this all the time, but now we're starting to realize that the gut most likely can also cause inflammation in the brain. So when you have these behaviors, the intestines actually have cells connected, kind of like this. And what happens is when you start to have some behaviors like over-exercising and the vomiting and the purging and everything, what happens is you break apart the cell connections. So then you get kind of this leaky gut, where the bacteria is now exposed to your immune system, and your immune system can generate an inflammatory response in relation to that bacteria there. And then that inflammatory response can actually go to your brain. And when it goes to your brain, is it responsible for some of the reasons why these people just do not respond to the current behaviors. They just can't learn new behaviors when they're in this like currently sick state. And so that's really where, and then you become more obsessed with, with your weight and with your exercise and with those behaviors. And so it becomes this very vicious cycle that's related to it. So that's really where the focus of my research is in the future, is that we're trying to get some preliminary data, which Carrie explained she had before her NIH grant, and I'm hoping to apply for one in the future. But in order to be able to do that, we have to have some preliminary data stating that this is actually going on in our patients. So what we're looking to do is we're looking to measure inflammation through the two markers I explained to. So we actually take stool samples and I analyze them to figure out what bacteria is present in your intestines. I then take blood samples and I look for the different inflammatory markers that we mentioned. And then we're hoping to be able to follow them over the course of their illness to determine whether or not people who have kind of different bacteria in their gut, different inflammatory states, go treatment differently. Are they more responsive to treatment than those who do not have the same bacteria and inflammatory markers? And so kind of, I guess, at this point in time, Carrie can talk a little bit about how this all comes together and how, we structure our lives based upon these different grants.
Yeah, so the last slide is just sort of, the way that researchers work and the way that funding works is not, it seems very, very esoteric if you're not in this academic system here. But so right now I have this NIH R01 award, which is basically a 5-year grant, and it funds my salary of co-investigators that I work with and the staff, and it gives us enough money to recruit people, to do assessments in the office, and to do that initial brain scan. And they want me to get 40 women with anorexia and 40 with bulimia and 40 healthy controls, and we have kind of specific hypotheses. Like one of our hypotheses is that anorexia and bulimia are going to have similar brain activations, and that people with bulimia may have more differences relating to other people, whereas the anorexia, the starvation state, we think may be more internal. So we have hypotheses to do that, and they're very worked out and they're very kind of high end. But if we actually want to start moving, so I've always done all this translational research, and I probably would have been happy doing translational research if all the programs were like the program that I had worked with. And I would think, okay, the people that are giving treatment know how treatment is given, and that's fine and that's good, and I'm just going to kind of figure out how the brain works, how to map that, and that'll help sort of promote why people should go to treatment, and that will kind of improve people getting treatment for eating disorders in general. One of the things that we didn't really talk about was like sort of with the HOG grant, you kind of go in, most people think that if people just got treatment, they'd be fine, but that HOG grant really demonstrates that people, even people that get treatment are not fine, and so we really need to have the right kinds of treatment, and some of it may be that they're not getting the social kinds of treatments that I think they need, and then there may be these physiological problems that are kind of, maybe that, a quarter, 40% of people with the illness, really there's no way for them to get the kind of treatments that they need. And so to change this care delivery, like that moves you from sort of translational research, which is like sort of one piece of how NIH funds things, into like clinical treatment trials. And in order to get started on a clinical treatment trial, you need to have a ton of pilot data showing that this kind of thing works, and you can't get any funding until you have that. And so the intervention study, that attribution bias group, we've been trying to, just doing that, like to have people to do that, like to be able to, like the art therapist right now is volunteering her time to do these 2 groups so that we can get pilot data, but she ought to be paid. She, especially with the program ending and things like that. So generally, when you augment, you don't have to pay necessarily. When I get a foundation grant, often they don't allow funding for the principal investigator. They want UT Southwestern, part of my salary should support that. Whether they will or not, that's another thing, another issue. But generally, with a lot of the foundation grants, like the Brain and Behavior Foundation, I've gotten a couple grants from them, and then the Hogg Foundation, and Children's has gave me a research grant as well. But generally, these kind of grants that augment, it's much cheaper, right? Because you're just adding a small thing onto a study, like adding a second brain scan. Each brain scan is like $500. This poop samples are
The gut microbiome analysis is actually really expensive.
It's really expensive to do things like that. So right now, for example, so I don't have any money from any sort of source right now to pay to collect blood and stool from the people that are in my NIH grant, because my NIH grant is for brain imaging. But the biomarker collection is a totally different thing. So I've been, she's submitting a grant next month, but we're trying to get money. And so right now we're storing the biomarkers with some, money that I moved out of my salary in a weird way to store them so that someday we can look at them. And so it becomes this patchwork of putting together, this is a little piece and this is a little piece and this is a little piece. I have a grant in right now actually to see if I can get NIH to pay for me to follow the people that we have in the R01, just like I got the Hogg Foundation grant to follow the people originally. And so now that I have the Hogg data and have shown that I can follow people, maybe NIH will give me, but that's another thing that right now we're enrolling all the subjects and we're paying them $5 for each monthly survey, and I think another $25 every 3 months to talk to me on the phone to show that we can keep the people engaged. But ultimately, we want to put them back in the scanner at 1 year so we can really track the course of all these brain changes. And so this is kind of where these kinds of small foundations, supplemental grants, it generally requires some staff, we rely on the base staffing and then we kind of add on specific targeted things. And so we just have, it's a good place to be where you have so many ideas and things to study, but it's also I feel when you work with the patients and you're just so sad that they can't get the right treatments and they can't get the right care, it's really, it needs to change now so that we're not continuing to have these high mortality rates and just lose people that may or may not respond to conventional treatment. And then in this area, 25% of our state doesn't have any health insurance. And so a lot of times the people I see for my research studies are coming for the fund because they get paid to come. And then it's really, but I can't offer treatments to them. We're doing this little intervention group. And so that's, some people can come and get at least a little bit of therapy and a little bit of check-in. But there's a lot of people without any, that age out of the health insurance from their parents, and there's really nothing for them to get care for this really complicated illness. And so kind of reclassifying it into more starvation. So when they're starving, they can be at JPS or Parkland to get rehabilitated a little bit. But as soon as their vital signs are stable, it's very hard to keep those people in a hospital long enough to get to nourished body and brain. And so it's really a disaster. I think we get at least one a month, sometimes 2 a month, that are very low unfunded people that are starving in our hospital systems. And it's just really sad that we don't have any way to provide any care for them.
And it's challenging because
the staff is reduced, the lights are turned down, the doors are all closed. Pretty much the only noise you hear is the whispering of the staff that's there and the beeping of the equipment. And as you walk down a hallway to meet your spouse or the mother of your child, you know for a fact your life will never be the same, because the worst fear a parent can have has just happened. There are a few of you guys who have experienced that fear. and you look the mother of your child in the eyes and you tell her she's gone. And that brings tears and this agonizing pain. And all you want to do is get back to your child one last time. And you're walking down that hallway again, and you're hearing the agonizing cries in the background. At the same time, you can almost hear this mocking laughter from you. Many people with eating disorders manifest the disease as a friend. It isolates them. It takes them away from their true friends. And you almost hear this mocking laughter. You almost hear this voice saying, I told you you could not withstand the storm. And you know for a fact, your life will never be the same. Well, that's the end of a journey and the start of another. But let's look at how this journey starts and goes through. Morgan, my son's sister, my beloved daughter, suffered from various eating disorders for 7+ years. We know that Kelly and Morgan were alike in some ways, in some way they're not. As I understand it, Kelly didn't receive eating disorder treatment. She didn't go to residential programs. She didn't go to doctors. So I'm here to walk through the process a little bit. And ordinarily when an attorney says, I'll be brief, you ought to roll your eyes because you know he's going to go on and on and on. But I've had the privilege of giving 2 TED Talks in the last year. They limit their talks to 18 minutes or fewer, because that's the ultimate time that you can really get the message across. So we're going to do this in 18 or fewer, or 18 or less, whichever word you wish to use. The first line of defense in an eating disorder is with our primary care physicians, our pediatricians, the doctors that have seen our loved ones from day one. And ordinarily we see that something isn't right with our child. They start to isolate themselves. Their glands in their cheeks might become swollen. There are various signs that can be seen. So if our doctors are up to speed, they run a blood test, and the blood test shows either their calcium or magnesium or sodium levels are a little bit off. Their potassium. How it happened to us, Morgan was walking out of a movie theater, passed out, fell, cracked her chin again, took her to the ER, of course. They ran blood tests. Doctor pulled me aside and said, Mr. Dunn, we have a little bit of an issue with her blood test. I'm thinking, oh my God, they found cocaine or meth or something. And the doctor looks at me and says, well, her potassium level is off. I said, oh, you didn't find any drugs at all? Oh, thank God. He said, Mr. Dunn, that's indicative of she could have an eating disorder. She could have anorexia. This was a young doctor, probably not too long out of his residency, or maybe he was serving his residency there. We were lucky that we did find a doctor like that, because we also found that after a while, we took her to a counselor, and the counselor confirmed, and she began to have other issues, and we found out she had a leaking heart valve, which was also indicative of this disease. And we're thinking, why in the heck didn't the doctors catch this before? And the statistics show that our doctors today, in their average 3-year residency program, receive 1 hour of eating disorder treatment. 3 years, 1 hour. In 2012, the American Medical Association came out with a 17-minute online production about eating disorder and offered it free to their members, our doctors. 0.04% of the membership of the American Medical Association chose to review this 17-minute online course. That means for every 1,000 doctors, 4 bothered to look at this. This past year, I was asked to help a family in Maine. They had filed a complaint against their doctor for misdiagnosing, and it was more just making sure they had their records in place, and it sounded halfway intelligent. And in the state of Maine's findings in the case, this is from the board that oversees their doctors in the state, they said this case is colored by educated parents trying to get state-of-the-art care from a state known to have slim resources for this condition. They couldn't even refer to it as a disease. And unfortunately, that is what we are faced with ordinarily on the front lines. But if we're lucky enough to get a doctor who understands, then you put together a treatment team while your loved one is at home. You include, of course, a psychologist, maybe a psychologist counselor, a nutritionist, the primary care physician, and perhaps one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, the parents, moms and dads. And the child ordinarily cringes because they've got their friend, they've got their eating disorder who has isolated them, and what do my mom and dad know? You know, they're old. How can they possibly understand me and this disease? But if the counselor is skilled, they can bring out, and I know there's a split of thought on this as to whether you investigate the causes of the disease and whether it was a traumatic event or environment or genetic. But the thinking is coming around to more, let's refeed the brain. The brain needs nutrition so they can think clearly. And that's the best chance if you catch it early and get the family involved. Now, if you don't, if the condition worsens, then more often than not, you're sent to a residential treatment center. And this is where it gets good because you get the insurance companies involved then. A residential treatment center, if you don't have one in your state or nearby, you are sent to various states. Morgan went to treatment centers in Chicago, Phoenix a few times, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Denver, Lubbock. And it's almost like they, for lack of a better term, churn and burn the patients who come in. But at these residential treatment centers, they get counseling, meal education, nutrition advice. The doctors are supposed to monitor their progress. And ordinarily, the average stay at a residential treatment center is about 60 days. The average cost, if you're not insured, is about $1,200 a day. And they want to be paid in advance for at least a month. So after our loved ones are there for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, the insurance companies then they assign an adjuster. And the adjuster gets involved. And the residential treatment center is sending mostly just the hard statistics, the BMI and the weight. They ordinarily don't send the doctor's notes, nurse's notes, or counselor's notes. And then the insurance company makes the call as to how long our loved one stays. Well, you would think the insurance company would use these great objective guidelines that we have set forth by the American Psychiatric Association or the American Medical Association, incorporating the DSM-5 guidelines that set forth the disease and how it should be addressed. And they don't. And right now they don't have to. All they have to do is comply with the terms of what their insurance policy states. And the insurance contract doesn't have to incorporate those guidelines. It might simply be when their BMI, their body mass index, comes up to this amount, when they're within 80% of the recommended weight, then we're going to reduce them down to the next level of care. Ordinarily, and hopefully the doctors at the residential treatment center dispute that, and they do what's called a peer-to-peer. Whether your insurance company assigns ostensibly a doctor on the outside. Well, we know now that these insurance companies have contracts with medical clinics, and the doctor's sole role is to review insurance claims. And so this doctor for the insurance company is not an eating disorder specialist. Talked to Carrie McAdams last night and said, Carrie, you've done thousands of peer-to-peers. How many times have you done a peer-to-peer with a person who was trained specifically in eating disorders? And she said, 0. None. So the treatment for our loved ones is being done by a doctor for the insurance company who doesn't have to comply with the APA and AMA guidelines. So how many times did we get a call, let's say at noon on a day, and we were told, Stephen, the peer-to-peer review was denied. We can put your daughter on an airplane at 5 o'clock this afternoon or tomorrow, and if it's tomorrow, could you wire transfer $1,500 to us? Now imagine you have our loved one, your daughter, my daughter, your wife, going through this most challenging time in their life, only to be told, oh, your treatment here with people you finally established a rapport with ends today. That is the reality of what's happening at our residential treatment centers today. It's a lot worse, but it's a little bit off topic, so I will not go into the residential treatment centers more. But so when they're stepped down, they ordinarily go to, hopefully your community has a hospital or practice that can provide what's called PHP, Partial Hospital Program, where kids are there from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and they receive their meals there, and counseling, and individual counseling, and group counseling, and family counseling as well. And that lasts for as long on average as the insurance company says it does. And they're looking at BMI again, and they're looking at statistics again, and our doctors who are trained in this disease aren't making the decision how long they stay. But best case scenario, our loved ones start to recover and the family is actively involved in counseling. That's why I asked the question about dads in this play. I've seen 2 or 3 or 4 movies about eating disorders, and for the most part the dads are portrayed as non-existent or abusers. And I remember going to so many family group counseling meetings, and for the most part, the dads sit back and don't ask questions. And I remember Morgan, when I would show up, she'd give me a big hug, and she'd say, Daddy, I'm only going to let you ask 5 questions today. That's it. Ironic as heck that intensive outpatient is a lower standard than partial hospitalization. The names alone don't quite seem congruent with that. But when IOP happens and that ends, ideally you've got your counselor and nutritionist involved as well. And I can tell you there's not one insurance company that covers a nutritionist. So every time you and your loved one goes to see a nutritionist, it's $100 at least. Insurance doesn't cover that because they don't have to. It's not regarded as a medical session or counseling session. It's reviewed as advisory. Now, as Carrie said, the average treatment time is about 7 years. As I said before, the average cost of an RTC is about $1,200 a day. And the average death rate is about once every 62 minutes. You know, and I've said that statistic a number of times to people. And a statistic is just a statistic until it happens to you, or to you, or to you, or to you. And, you know, I haven't painted a very pretty picture here. But unfortunately, that's the reality of what we face. We're gripped by this fear that we're going to lose the most important thing to us. But if we don't keep our wits about us and fight the insurance companies as they can be fought, it really does become a full-time job. But there is hope, though. I've always loved one quote by Teddy Roosevelt. I think it was in 1903 when he said something like, "'Tis far better to dare mighty things, to achieve glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in this gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." Well, we have a given problem to solve, and we have to be bold. We have to look at bold options. We've got to be able to believe in the Carrie McAdams and the academic centers and the research centers that are doing work. You heard about this incredible microbiome research that's going on, and there's promise there. I gave a TEDx talk on this ultraviolet pulsing light treatment into the brain that goes into certain parts of the brain and activates the mitochondria that releases nitrous oxide, which a nucleus absorbs, and it's supposed to release the natural endorphins and oxytocin, natural neural hormones to level out the brain so our loved ones can more accurately process the information. But foundations like this have got to be at the forefront of the war. We've got to be able to stand up and just allow ourselves to be counted and collaborate with others who share our vision, our dreams. Because if we can prevent one parent from having to walk down that hospital hallway at night, if we can prevent one more Kelly or Morgan, we're investing in our future. And that's what you guys do. Any questions?
Yes. Moving, obviously. I guess my question is, what's the best way that we can change these insurance laws to help us help people who are sick?
Okay.
It seems like there should be, I don't know, a bill or something that could help with this.
Well, I can tell you we know the Texas legislature meets from January through May every other year. The last 3 times they met, Congressman Garnet Coleman down in Houston, who overcame a bipolar condition himself, has submitted an eating disorder bill going into adopting the guidelines and reviewing and that sort of thing. And every time it goes down to ignominious defeat, it doesn't even get out of committee because the insurance company lobby is so strong. Well, I believe we fight them in a different way. As an insured, you're entitled to all the information your insurance company has, including the identity of the doctor who participated in the peer-to-peer. You get his or her name, the state they're licensed in. You file a complaint with the State Board of Medical Examiners of the state that they are in. They're making medical decisions regarding an insured, our loved ones. And if they are making that decision not based upon the AMA guidelines or APA guidelines or the reasonable medical guidelines, technically that is malpractice. And the good thing about an administrative claim is in a doctor's malpractice insurance, it doesn't pay for defense of an administrative claim. That means they're going to have to go out and employ a fellow mouthpiece. And if a doctor came to me and said, Mr. Dunn, I just had a claim filed against me for, with the state board, I'd say, great, I'd love to represent you. I'm going to need about $15,000 paid in advance. These peer-to-peer doctors, if we start to hit them where it hurts, and just if we demand accountability from them, then they're going to go to the insurance companies and say, hey, my livelihood's on the hook here. I've got to start to comply with these recognized guidelines out there. In addition, we have some friends in Washington, D.C. who are working behind the scenes. We do know this Anna Weston Act was passed in December of 2016. It still is awaiting funding, of course, but it requires training for doctors and make sure that eating disorders are treated with parity laws. But for each time there is a claim, it's incumbent upon the parents to ask questions, to demand, to be pushy of the insurance company. If you get an adjuster on the phone and you're entitled to know who they are, they've got to respond to every question you have. And if it's just a ranting threats against them, they still, the insurance company has a duty to act in your best interest. So you can't take just what they say initially. You keep asking and probing and asking why these guidelines have not been adopted by them.
So do you have something as a resource, like on your website or somewhere, that would help parents understand this is the process that you have to take so we can make a movement out of it versus just, these kind of one-off things that are happening?
I am actually developing one right now. I'm working with a doctor in Utah, a doctor in North Carolina, a former Utah congressman, and in fact we're going after one of the largest residential treatment center programs here in the next month. In conjunction with that, we've begun to draft just guidelines of what you can do. I've gone into a number of Facebook groups and social media and put that out as well, but I think that's a really good idea to put it out there, and it will be up on my law firm website, the foundation website. We'll share it with you guys, of course, and the more we can spread the word about this, because it's really simple, the forms that to file a complaint, to how it's done, and for something like this, the betterment of society and helping kids is a heck of a lot more important than making an extra dime. Thank you guys for your time and attention, and I hope we have the opportunity to work together more down the road.
Thank you.